The Spirit of Medieval Philosophy, Part 3 and Conclusion. The doctrine of the analogy of being is one example of how the idea of being influenced medieval metaphysics. Gilson considers many other examples of this transformation of Greek metaphysics in the light of Christian belief. Two important areas of medieval philosophical concern which he discusses are ethics and history. One of the most noticeable differences between the ethical views of classical Greece and Christianity is the presence in the latter of the concept of sin. In Greek ethics and in Greek religion, there was no concern with sin in the Christian sense. There were, of course, rules regarding what was proper religious conduct, but they dealt mainly with ritual purity. And in Greek ethics there were general rules of conduct, but they were not interpreted in such a way as to make violations of them sinful acts. The best known Christian code of conduct, however, the Ten Commandments, was attributed directly to God, and God made it clear that violation of the commandments was a personal affront to him. For I, the Lord thy God, am a jealous God. Again, the Christian God was added to the philosophical tradition by the medievals, and a new synthesis emerged. The ethical principles of the Greeks were retained, but they were not merely the deliverances of reason, although the medievals did not deny that reason could and indeed had discovered them, but the ethical rules were also the expressions of God's will regarding man's conduct. Just as man's being was an indelible mark indicating the fact that he was a creature made by God, so man's conscience had written on it God's law. The Greeks had discovered the natural law because God had written the law on the hearts of all men. The Greeks knew the law, but they had not known that it was another stamp left on man by his Creator. But there was still more in the medieval ethical position. The Greeks believed that the rules of ethics told him how to live his life most satisfactorily here on earth. But there was no transcendent reference. For the Christian, however, conduct was the key not only to satisfactory living here in this life, but it was also the crucial determiner of his eternal destiny. Man's fulfillment for the medieval was not in this life, but in the life following the resurrection. This idea, Gilson argues, introduced two considerations that were lacking in the Greek view: a concern for the individual man as a being of eternal worth, and an attitude toward the physical world which again rested on an affirmation of the everlasting worth of the resurrected body. As another example of the shift from the usual perspective, which results from Gilson's sympathetic reading of medieval philosophy, we might note here his observation on medieval monastic asceticism. He points out that it does not originate in a Platonic rejection of the body as is the usual understanding. It reflects an effort to discipline the body in order to make that very body serve more adequately in its proper spiritual vocation. These observations about the consequences of the doctrine of the resurrection of the body for ethics lead easily into a consideration of the medieval philosophy of history. Surely the speculations of St. Augustine on time in the concluding books of the Confessions and the doctrine of the two cities in the city of God ensure Augustine's eminence in this area of philosophical inquiry. Gilson merely points out that this philosophy of history is another instance of the pervasive influence of the central idea of being in the thought of the medieval Christians. Where was I? Gilson merely points out that the philosophy of history is another instance of the pervasive influence of the central idea of being in thought of the medieval Christians. I'm not so well, I've got an underactive thyroid I've just been diagnosed with. It's not the only thing about me that's underactive. Anyway, to continue. The Greeks had only a cyclical view of history. They had no feeling at all for history as the tale of the significance of individual human striving. For St. Augustine in particular, and the medievals generally, however, history had an origin, a direction, and a goal, and was made up of the acts of individual human beings, beings with immortal souls, and with bodies which would again be active following the resurrection. History as told in terms of human personality and as having a beginning, the creation, a middle, the incarnation, and an end, the last judgment, was clearly the invention of medieval Christians. It resulted from speculation that operated against the background of Christian revelation. Such a conception of history was lacking in the Greek world. It originated in the medieval interval and remains with us today. In spite of the many excellences of Gilson's book and his refreshing refusal to view medieval philosophy as a pointless, logic-chopping debate over silly questions, there are certain inadequacies that remain. Some medieval philosophers are barely mentioned and their views are slighted. Siger of Brabante, whose avaricistic doctrine of separate truths for faith and reason does not fit in well with Gilson's picture, is an example. The tension at Paris during the 13th century between, on the one hand, Siger's emphasis on fidelity to Aristotle's own text, even when it conflicted with scripture and religious tradition, and on the other hand, the Thomist's concern to accommodate Aristotle to religious orthodoxy, is not given the discussion it should receive in a book on medieval philosophy. The realism-nominalism controversy, around which so much philosophical debate centered, is another problem which Gilson treats less fully than one might expect. Occam, a commanding figure in the law in the late medieval period, is given scant notice. Generally speaking, the Thomist synthesis occupies such a dominant position in the book that many of the rich counter-melodies of medieval thought do not emerge. And finally, the sophisticated Protestant reader, if that's not an oxymoron, cannot help feeling that some of Gilson's incidental remarks about Martin Luther reveal less sympathy for the spirit of the Reformation than they do for the spirit of Thomistic philosophy. It is a rare person indeed who can look at both St. Thomas and the impulsive and often horribly mistaken Luther without feeling that one of them is seriously in error. But one suspects that there must have been, in the medieval period, a tradition that somehow provided a background for the Reformation. The nominalist Occam and the philosophers who held that will was superior to intellect in God provided part of this background. Gilson leaves the reader with the feeling that these stresses were almost entirely missing in the medieval period, in the medieval intellectual milieu. But these are errors of omission, not of commission. It would be a mistake to make more of them, not merely to mention them. And Gilson himself has shown in other of his writings His awareness of the influences which he here neglects, in spite of its shortcomings, Gilson's book remains an excellent interpretation of what is clearly the main current of medieval thought. A book that no historian of philosophy can afford to be without. A book that makes understandable and commendable the current revival of interest in scholastic philosophy generally and in St. Thomas specifically. I had a slight problem with my sound recorder then. Anyway, I'm back. Anyway, neo-Thomists have enriched contemporary philosophy considerably in areas as diverse as philosophy of religion and logic. Professor Gilson's very significant role as one of the leaders among this group may come as no surprise. Anyone who reads The Spirit of Medieval Philosophy. So I'm sure you will now all put it on your reading list. The end.